The city was unusually quiet that night, its streets washed with the faint glow of neon signs. Alex walked briskly, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets to keep out the cold. The sound of his boots echoed in the emptiness, broken only by the occasional hum of a passing drone overhead. It was late, and most of the shops had closed. He didn't usually take this route, but tonight, something had compelled him to change his path. As he rounded a corner, his eyes caught a movement in the shadows. At first, he thought it might be a stray animal. The city had its share of scavenging creatures, and he was used to ignoring them. But this wasn't an animal. It was a figure, a person, slumped against the wall of an old building, barely visible under the dim streetlights. Alex hesitated. Something about the figure seemed off. They were too still, and their posture screamed of exhaustion. Against his better judgment, he stepped closer. His heartbeat quickened as he got a better look. It was a woman. No, not just any woman, an alien. Her skin was a pale shade of blue, with faint patterns that glimmered like tiny constellations under the light. Her long, dark hair clung to her face, damp with sweat. She was trembling, clutching her knees to her chest, as if trying to disappear into herself. Alex's first instinct was to turn and walk away. Helping aliens wasn't just risky, it was illegal. The government had strict policies against harboring non-humans. He could get fined, or worse. But as he took a step back, her eyes opened. They were large and bright, filled with a mix of fear and desperation. She looked at him as if pleading for help, her lips parting slightly as though she wanted to speak, but didn't have the strength. "Are you okay?" Alex asked, his voice unsure. He felt ridiculous even as the words left his mouth. Of course, she wasn't okay. She was sitting alone in the cold, clearly starving and terrified. The alien woman didn't respond. Her gaze flickered to the bag slung over his shoulder. Alex realized she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the sandwich poking out of the top of his bag. She's hungry, he thought. His mind raced. He could just give her the sandwich and leave. That wasn't illegal, right? It wasn't like he was taking her home or anything. But even that felt like a risk. What if someone saw him? What if she was dangerous? "Here," he said finally, pulling the sandwich out of his bag. He crouched a safe distance away and held it out to her. "Take it." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between him and the food. Her hands, thin and trembling, slowly reached out. She snatched the sandwich and held it close to her chest, as if afraid he might take it back. "It's okay," Alex said softly. "You can eat it." She unwrapped the sandwich with shaking fingers and took a small bite, then another. Within seconds, she was devouring it, chewing so quickly that Alex worried she might choke. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. How long had it been since she'd eaten? "What's your name?" he asked, hoping to make her feel less afraid. She paused, her eyes narrowing as if she was trying to understand his question. "Name," she said, her voice faint and raspy. It was the first time he heard her speak. Her accent was strange, her words broken. Lina." "Lina," Alex repeated, nodding. "I'm Alex." She didn't respond, focusing instead on finishing the last of the sandwich. When she was done, she leaned back against the wall, her eyes fluttering shut. For a moment, Alex thought she might fall asleep right there. But then he heard it, the faint whir of a patrol drone in the distance. His stomach sank. The drones didn't usually come to this part of the city unless they were looking for something or someone. Alex glanced at Lina. She didn't seem to notice the sound, but her vulnerability was obvious. If the drones found her, there was no telling what they'd do. He'd heard stories about aliens being dragged away, never to be seen again. "You can't stay here," he said urgently, his voice low. Lina's eyes snapped open, and she looked at him in confusion. "The patrols, if they find you, you're in trouble." She stared at him, her expression unreadable. Did she even understand what he was saying? The sound of the drone grew louder, closer. Alex cursed under his breath. He didn't have time to explain. "Come on," he said, reaching out his hand. "We need to move. Now." For a moment, Lina hesitated, her gaze flicking between his hand and the dark street beyond. Then, slowly, she placed her hand in his. Her skin was cold and fragile, but her grip was surprisingly firm. Alex pulled her to her feet, and they began to move. The drone's hum grew fainter as they ducked into a narrow alley, disappearing into the shadows. Alex didn't know what he was doing, but one thing was clear. He couldn't leave her behind. Alex sat on the edge of his worn-out couch, staring at the alien woman who now occupied the farthest corner of his small apartment. Lina sat curled up with her knees drawn to her chest, her wide, glowing eyes scanning every inch of the room. She looked out of place, an otherworldly figure in a space that reeked of human simplicity. Mismatched furniture, a flickering ceiling light, and a half-empty pizza box on the table. He still wasn't sure why he had brought her here. Every rational thought in his head had screamed for him to leave her on the street. It wasn't his problem, and he had enough of his own to deal with. But the memory of her hollow eyes and trembling form had gnawed at his conscience. Now, sitting here with a literal alien refugee in his apartment, Alex couldn't decide if he was brave or just plain stupid. Lina hadn't said much since they arrived. She'd accepted a bottle of water he offered, drinking it in small, cautious sips like someone who expected it to be taken away at any moment. She held the bottle tightly, her fingers curling around it as though it was the most precious thing in the world. "You can relax," Alex said, trying to sound calm, though his nerves were shot. "No one's going to hurt you here." Her eyes met his, and for a moment there was silence. Then she spoke, her voice soft and broken, her words halting as though she was pulling them from the depths of her memory. "Why you help me?" she asked. The question caught Alex off guard. He hadn't really thought about it. He shrugged, leaning back on the couch. "I don't know," he admitted. "It just felt like the right thing to do." Lina tilted her head, studying him, as if his answer didn't quite make sense to her. "Human, not help. My kind," she said slowly. "They hate us." Alex sighed, running a hand through his hair. She wasn't wrong. The media was full of stories about alien refugees being blamed for everything from rising unemployment to petty crime. People were afraid of them, and fear had a way of turning into hate. "Not all humans," he said. "Some of us aren't that bad." She gave him a skeptical look, but there was a faint flicker of something in her eyes. Hope, maybe. The moment was interrupted by a loud, mechanical whirring sound outside the window. Alex froze, his breath catching in his throat. He recognized that sound. A patrol drone. Its bright, sweeping lights passed over the building, lingering for a moment before moving on. Lina's body tensed, and she shrank further into the corner, her face pale. Alex cursed under his breath. He'd forgotten how heavily patrolled this part of the city was. "They're just passing by," he said quickly, trying to reassure her. "We're safe here." But even as he said it, doubt crept into his mind. How long could he keep her here without drawing attention? The neighbors weren't exactly the nosy type, but all it would take was one wrong move, one slip-up, and the authorities would come knocking. Lina seemed to sense his unease. "I leave," she said, her voice trembling. "No trouble for you." Alex shook his head. "No way. I didn't bring you here just to throw you back out there." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, maybe, but also confusion. "Why?" she asked again. "Why risk for me?" Alex hesitated. He didn't have a good answer. Maybe it was because he'd always been the kind of guy who rooted for the underdog. Or maybe it was because, despite everything, he believed that people, human or alien, deserved a second chance. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "Someone I couldn't help before, I guess. I don't want to make that mistake again." Lina didn't respond, but her gaze softened, and she nodded slightly. as if she understood. The sound of the patrol drone faded into the distance, and Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. For now, they were safe, but he knew this was just the beginning. He glanced at Lina, who was still clutching the empty water bottle like a lifeline. "You're going to need more than water and a sandwich," he said. "We'll figure something out. I promise." Her lips parted slightly, and she gave the faintest hint of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Alex feel like he'd made the right choice, at least for now. But deep down, he knew the clock was ticking. The city wasn't a forgiving place, and harboring an alien wasn't just illegal, it was dangerous. If they were going to survive, he'd need a plan. And fast. The night outside was eerily silent, but Alex's small apartment felt anything but calm. Lina sat perched near the window, her sharp eyes scanning the streets below. Her slender, blue fingers rested lightly on the edge of the curtain, pulling it back just enough to peek outside without drawing attention. The faint glow of her skin reflected in the glass, a subtle reminder that she didn't belong here. Alex paced the room, his mind racing. Every passing minute felt like an eternity. He had made a decision, one that couldn't be undone. Keeping Lina here was a gamble, but leaving her to fend for herself was unthinkable. The patrol drones were relentless, and the government's stance on aliens was clear. Anyone caught harboring one faced severe punishment. "Okay," Alex said, breaking the tense silence. "We can't stay here. It's too risky. If those patrols figure out you're here," he didn't need to finish the sentence. Lina turned her head, her bright eyes locking onto his. "Where go?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with urgency. Alex ran a hand through his hair, sighing deeply. "I don't know yet, but we need to move. Somewhere safe, somewhere they won't think to look." Lina nodded, her expression calm despite the danger. "I trust you," she said, her words halting but sincere. Alex stopped pacing and looked at her, caught off guard by the weight of her trust. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. But the sound of a distant drone snapped him back to reality. He grabbed a small backpack from the corner of the room and started stuffing it with essentials: a flashlight, a water bottle, some protein bars, and a thin blanket. He glanced at Lina. "Do you have anything? Anything you need to bring?" She shook her head. "No, nothing." Her answer hit Alex harder than he expected. Nothing. She had nothing to her name, not even a single possession. He tightened the straps on the bag and slung it over his shoulder. "All right," he said. "Let's go." Lina followed him to the door, her movements quiet and deliberate. Alex paused, listening carefully for any sounds from the hallway. When he was sure it was clear, he opened the door just enough to slip through, motioning for Lina to follow. The hallway was dimly lit, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Every creak of the floorboards felt deafening as they crept toward the stairwell. Alex's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if it was fear or adrenaline, or maybe both. When they reached the ground floor, Alex stopped again, peering through the glass doors that led to the street. A patrol drone hovered in the distance, its bright spotlight sweeping across the buildings. "Stay close," he whispered. Lina nodded, her glowing eyes narrowing with focus. They slipped out into the cool night air, sticking to the shadows as they moved through the narrow alleyways. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and glowing advertisements, felt like a labyrinth. Alex knew the patrol drones would be scanning every corner for signs of alien refugees. As they turned a corner, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them. Alex froze, holding up a hand to stop Lina. He pressed his back against the wall, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by muffled voices. "Search the area," a gruff voice ordered. They couldn't have gone far. Alex's stomach churned. The patrol officers were close, too close. He glanced at Lina, who looked calm but alert, her glowing patterns dimming slightly as if trying to blend into the darkness. "This way," Alex whispered, motioning toward a narrow gap between two buildings. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was their best chance. They slipped into the gap, the rough brick wall scraping against Alex's jacket. Lina moved with surprising grace, her life form gliding through the tight space. On the other side, they found themselves in another alley, this one darker and quieter. "Are you okay?" Alex asked, his voice low. Lina nodded, but her breathing was shallow, her eyes darting around. Before Alex could say anything else, the whir of a patrol drone grew louder. A bright spotlight swept across the alley, illuminating everything in its path. "Down," Alex hissed, pulling Lina behind a stack of crates. They crouched low, the harsh light passing just inches above their heads. Alex's heart felt like it might burst out of his chest. He held his breath, his hand resting lightly on Lina's shoulder to keep her still. The drone hovered for what felt like an eternity before moving on. When the light finally disappeared, Alex let out a shaky breath. "We can't keep doing this," he muttered. Lina's gaze softened, her expression a mix of gratitude and guilt. "You saved me." "Again," she said quietly. Alex shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I couldn't leave you out there." She gave him a small, hesitant smile, and for a moment, the tension lifted. But Alex knew they weren't out of danger yet. The patrols would only get more aggressive as the night went on. They needed to find shelter, and fast. "Come on," he said, standing up and offering her his hand. "Let's keep moving." Lina took his hand without hesitation, her grip firm despite her delicate appearance. Together, they disappeared into the shadows, the city stretching out before them like a maze with no clear way out. The small, abandoned warehouse Alex found was cold and damp, but it offered something rare: silence. The heavy steel door creaked as he pushed it shut behind them. Inside, the air smelled faintly of rust and old wood. Crates were stacked haphazardly in the corners, remnants of a time when the building had been alive with activity. Alex set the backpack down on an overturned crate, his shoulders slumping. He was exhausted, his legs aching from hours of walking and dodging patrols. Lina stood a few feet away, her glowing eyes scanning the dim interior. She seemed even more fragile under the harsh light filtering through the broken windows, but her movements were deliberate, as though she was constantly ready to flee. "This should be safe for now," Alex said, his voice breaking the heavy silence. He pulled out the blanket and spread it on the floor, gesturing for Lina to sit. She hesitated, her gaze flicking between him and the blanket. Then, with slow, measured steps, she lowered herself onto it, folding her legs beneath her. "Thank you," she said softly. Her words were clearer now, though still tinged with an accent that made her sound almost musical. Alex leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. "Don't thank me yet. We're not out of this mess." Lina tilted her head, her glowing patterns shifting slightly, as if reacting to her emotions. "Why? You do this?" she asked. Alex rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to answer. It was the same question she'd asked before, and he still didn't have a clear answer. "I guess. I just couldn't leave you out there. It didn't feel right." Her expression softened, but there was a flicker of something else in her eyes. Curiosity, maybe even confusion. "Humans, not kind to my people," she said. Alex sighed, his gaze falling to the floor. "Yeah, I know. We're not exactly known for our hospitality, are we?" He gave a bitter laugh. "But not all of us are like that. Some of us, we see things differently." Lina studied him for a moment, as though trying to decide if she believed him. Then she said, "On my world, we help each other. Always. Even when. No reason." Alex looked up, surprised. "That sounds nice. Wish it was like that here." Lina nodded, her glowing patterns pulsing faintly. "It is not perfect, but we try." For a moment, they sat in silence, the distance between their worlds feeling smaller than it had before. Tell me about your world, Alex said suddenly. Lina's eyes brightened, and for the first time, a small smile played on her lips. It is beautiful, she said. Green skies, purple oceans, and trees that sing. Trees that sing. Alex raised an eyebrow. She nodded, her expression growing wistful. Their leaves move in wind, make music. Every song different. Alex couldn't help but smile. Sounds like something out of a dream. Lina's smile faded, replaced by a look of sorrow. But it is gone. Our son, dying. No more songs. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air. Alex felt a pang of guilt for asking, but before he could apologize, she continued. We left, she said, her voice quieter now. Came here. Thought. Humans help us. But she trailed off, her eyes dropping to the floor. Alex clenched his fists, anger bubbling in his chest. He knew she was right. Humanity had failed her people, turning them away when they needed help most. I'm sorry, he said, his voice thick with regret. We should have done better. You deserved better. Lina looked at him, her glowing eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sadness. You are better, she said. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't feel like he was better, not really. He was just a guy trying to do the right thing in a world that made it almost impossible. The sound of something falling outside snapped them both to attention. Alex stood up quickly, motioning for Lina to stay down. He moved to the nearest window, peering out cautiously. A stray cat darted across the alley, knocking over a tin can. Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and turned back to Lina. Just a cat, he said, trying to sound calm. But the tension in his chest didn't ease. He knew they couldn't stay here for long. Do you have a plan? Lina asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Alex nodded slowly. There's a group, people who help refugees like you. It's risky, but if we can find them, they might be able to get you somewhere safe. Lina's glowing patterns shifted again, a sign of her unease. You risk too much, she said. Alex shook his head. It's worth it. You're worth it. For the first time, Lina looked at him without fear, her expression softening into something close to trust. Then, we go, she said. Alex nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he would get her to safety. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't let her down. The cold wind bit at Alex's face as he and Lina slipped through the shadowed streets of the city. Every sound, the faint hum of a passing drone, the distant murmur of voices, set Alex's nerves on edge. His grip tightened on the strap of his backpack as he led Lina through a maze of alleys and side streets. He had to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help either of them. Lina followed closely, her movements fluid and silent. Her glowing patterns were dimmer now, a subtle change she had made to avoid drawing attention. Alex marveled at her adaptability, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. They had a destination, and every second wasted increased the risk of being caught. Are you okay? He asked over his shoulder, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Lina replied, her voice steady but soft. I follow. Alex nodded, his gaze darting around for any sign of danger. They were headed to a part of the city he barely knew, a place rumored to be a haven for refugees and outcasts. He had heard whispers of an underground network that helped aliens like Lina, but finding it was another matter. He only had vague directions and the faint hope that someone would help them. The faint glow of neon signs reflected off puddles on the cracked pavement. Alex paused at a corner, peeking out to scan the street ahead. It was empty, save for a few parked vehicles. He motioned for Lina to follow, and they darted across, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. Just as they reached the next alley, a loud voice shattered the silence. Stop right there. Alex's heart lurched. He turned to see two patrol officers at the far end of the street, their uniforms dark and menacing. One of them held a scanner, its screen glowing ominously. "Run," Alex shouted, grabbing Lina's hand. They bolted down the alley, the officer's shouts echoing behind them. Alex's mind raced. He hadn't planned for this. The narrow alley offered little cover, and the sound of heavy boots pounding the pavement grew louder. This way. Alex veered toward a side door, hoping it was unlocked. He yanked on the handle, and to his relief, it opened. They slipped inside, closing the door as quietly as possible. Alex pressed his back against it, his chest heaving as he listened for the officers outside. Lina stood nearby, her breathing rapid but controlled. Her glowing eyes met Alex's, and he could see the fear there, though she didn't say a word. The footsteps outside slowed, and Alex held his breath. A flashlight beam passed over the small window in the door, its harsh light briefly illuminating the room. Alex's heart thundered in his chest. If the officers decided to check inside, they were done for. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded. Alex waited a moment longer before exhaling slowly. "That was close," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Lina nodded, her voice barely audible. Too close. The room they had entered was small and cluttered, filled with old furniture and stacks of boxes. It smelled of dust and mildew, but it was a temporary refuge. Alex moved to one of the windows, peeking out to ensure the coast was clear. "They'll be back," he said grimly. "We need to keep moving." Lina hesitated, her glowing patterns flickering faintly. "You risk too much," she said. "For me." Alex turned to her, his expression serious. "I told you, I'm not going to let them take you. We're in this together now." Her gaze softened, but before she could respond, a faint noise drew their attention. It came from the far corner of the room. A rustling sound, followed by a low groan. Alex tensed, motioning for Lina to stay back. He moved cautiously toward the noise, his footsteps barely making the sound. As he rounded a stack of boxes, he saw the source. A man, slumped against the wall, his face pale and gaunt. The man's eyes flickered open, and he weakly raised a hand. "Help," he whispered. Alex crouched beside him, his mind racing. The man was human, but he looked like he had been through hell. His clothes were tattered, and there was a dark stain spreading across his side. "Who did this to you?" Alex asked, keeping his voice low. The man coughed weakly. "Patrols caught me hiding with them," he said, his voice rasping. "They don't care, human or alien." Alex felt a chill run down his spine. The man's words confirmed his worst fears. The patrols weren't just targeting aliens anymore. Anyone who helped them was fair game. "We need to go," Alex said, standing up. He turned to Lina, who had moved closer, her glowing eyes filled with concern. "We can't leave him," she said quietly. Alex hesitated. The man was in bad shape, and taking him along would slow them down, but leaving him here felt wrong. "Fine," Alex said, pulling the man's arm over his shoulder, "but we need to move fast." The man groaned as Alex helped him to his feet, his weight almost too much to bear. Lina moved to his other side, her delicate frame surprisingly strong as she supported him. Together, they slipped out of the building and into the night. The city loomed around them, its lights cold and unfeeling. Alex knew the odds were against them, but he couldn't afford to think about that now. All that mattered was getting to safety, whatever that meant. The trio moved through the city's shadows, each step more treacherous than the last. Alex's shoulders ached from supporting the wounded man, and his mind raced with doubts. He wasn't sure how much farther they could go. Lina, though visibly tired, carried herself with an unshakable resolve, her glowing patterns pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The wounded man, whose name they learned was Marcus, groaned softly with each step, but urged them not to stop. "Not much farther," Marcus whispered, his voice weak but determined. "There's a safe house An old mechanic's shop, 2 blocks ahead. Alex nodded, tightening his grip on Marcus to keep him upright. "We'll get you there," he said, though he wasn't sure how much he believed it himself. The streets grew quieter as they neared the industrial district, where rusting warehouses and abandoned factories stood like forgotten relics of a different era. The glow of the city's neon signs faded, replaced by an eerie darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of a malfunctioning street lamp. As they approached the mechanic's shop, a sudden sound stopped Alex in his tracks. It was faint at first, a soft hum, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder with each passing second. He turned to Lina, whose glowing eyes widened in alarm. "Drones," she whispered. Alex's stomach dropped. He scanned the area, his pulse quickening as he spotted a faint light in the distance. The patrol drones were closing in, their relentless search patterns sweeping the area. "We need to move now," Alex said, his voice sharp. Lina nodded, and they quickened their pace, practically dragging Marcus toward the shop. The building was old and rundown, its faded sign barely legible in the dim light. Alex pushed open the rusted door, the hinges groaning loudly in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of oil and metal. The workshop was cluttered with tools, old parts, and machines that hadn't been touched in years. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting long, dancing shadows across the room. Marcus gestured weakly toward a trapdoor in the corner. "Underground," he said. "It's safe." Alex and Lina moved quickly, lifting the heavy trapdoor to reveal a dark staircase leading into the depths. The faint hum of the drones grew louder, their lights now visible through the dusty windows. "Hurry," Alex urged, guiding Marcus down the stairs. Lina followed close behind, her glowing patterns dimming instinctively to blend into the shadows. The underground space was small but secure, its walls reinforced with metal panels. A few crates were stacked in the corner, and a single cot lay against the far wall. It was a far cry from comfortable, but it was safe for now. As Alex helped Marcus onto the cot, Lina explored the space, her movements careful and deliberate. She paused by a terminal in the corner, its screen cracked but still functional. Her glowing fingers danced over the controls, and the screen flickered to life. "What are you doing?" Alex asked, moving to her side. Lina glanced at him, her expression serious. "Looking for them," she said. Alex frowned. "Who?" "The network," she replied. "The ones who help us." Alex's chest tightened. He had heard of the underground network that aided alien refugees, but finding them was another story. They operated in the shadows, their locations and members a closely guarded secret. The terminal beeped, and Lina's face lit up with hope. "There," she said, pointing to a map on the screen. A location was marked, not far from where they were. Alex leaned in, studying the map. "That's close. We might actually make it." Marcus coughed, drawing their attention. His face was pale, and his breathing shallow. "You can't stay here long," he said, his voice strained. "They'll search everywhere." Alex nodded. "We'll leave as soon as you're stable." Lina turned to Marcus, her glowing eyes filled with concern. "You saved many before," she said softly. "Now, we save you." Marcus managed a weak smile. "You're stronger than they think," he said, his gaze shifting between Alex and Lina. "Don't let them win." Alex felt a surge of determination. Marcus was right. They couldn't let fear or oppression dictate their actions. They had to keep going, not just for themselves, but for everyone who couldn't fight back. The sound of a distant explosion shook the ground, dust falling from the ceiling. Alex's heart raced. The drones were searching more aggressively now, and it was only a matter of time before they closed in. "We need to move," Alex said firmly. "Lina, can you remember the way to that location?" She nodded. "I will lead." Alex helped Marcus to his feet, though the man could barely stand. Lina moved to his other side, her slim frame stronger than it appeared. Together, they ascended the stairs, their movements cautious but urgent. Outside, the city was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound feel amplified. The trio stuck to the shadows, Lina's glowing patterns now barely visible. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he pushed the thought aside. They had no choice but to keep moving. As they neared the edge of the industrial district, a voice called out from the darkness, "Stop right there." Alex froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly to see a figure stepping out of the shadows, a patrol officer, his weapon raised. Behind him, two more officers emerged, their faces cold and unyielding. Alex's heart pounded. There was no way out. But before he could react, Lina stepped forward, her glowing patterns flaring brightly. "What are you doing?" Alex hissed. Lina didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hands, her eyes locking onto the officers. The glow from her skin intensified, casting an otherworldly light across the scene. The officers hesitated, their weapons lowering slightly as they stared in awe and confusion. "Run," Lina whispered to Alex and Marcus. "But," Alex began. "Go," she said, her voice firm. Reluctantly, Alex grabbed Marcus and began to move, his heart heavy with guilt as he left Lina behind. He didn't know what she was planning, but he trusted her. He had to. As he disappeared into the darkness, the last thing he saw was Lina standing tall, her glowing patterns forming a mesmerizing display of light and defiance. Alex's lungs burned as he sprinted through the narrow streets, Marcus leaning heavily on his shoulder. Every step felt like a betrayal, leaving Lina behind. His mind screamed to turn back, but he knew he couldn't. Her last words echoed in his ears. Run. She had made her choice, and now he had to honor it. The industrial district faded into the background as they crossed into a quieter part of the city. The streets were darker here, the faint hum of patrol drones replaced by the occasional rustle of wind through alleyways. Alex's legs felt like lead, but he pushed on, driven by a mix of desperation and determination. "We're close," Marcus wheezed, his voice barely audible. Alex glanced at him, worry etched across his face. Marcus was pale, his breath shallow, but his eyes held a glimmer of resolve. Alex tightened his grip, steadying him as they approached their destination, a small, nondescript building tucked between two abandoned storefronts. The door was old and weathered, its paint peeling away. Alex knocked twice, then 3 more times, following the pattern Marcus had instructed. For a moment, there was silence, and Alex's heart sank. What if they had been abandoned? What if this was all for nothing? Then, a faint click echoed from the other side. The door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. A woman, her sharp eyes scanning them with suspicion. She looked human, but her movements were too precise, too calculated to belong to someone untrained. "Who sent you?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. "Marcus," Alex said quickly. "He's with me. He's hurt." The woman's eyes flicked to Marcus, and her expression softened, though her guard didn't drop entirely. "Bring him in," she said, stepping aside. Alex guided Marcus inside, the door shutting firmly behind them. The room was small but bustling with quiet activity. A few figures moved through the space, their faces shadowed by hoods. Alex noticed the faint glow of alien patterns on some of their skin, a subtle but unmistakable sign of who they were helping. The woman motioned to a cot in the corner. "Lay him down there." Alex did as instructed, gently lowering Marcus onto the cot. One of the figures, a tall, lanky man with glasses, immediately stepped forward, examining Marcus with practiced hands. "He's lost a lot of blood," the man muttered, "but he'll live." Relief washed over Alex, but it was short-lived. His mind was still on Lina, on the moment she had stepped forward to face the patrols alone. The woman noticed his distant expression. "You're thinking about someone," she said. Alex nodded. Lina, she stayed behind to let us escape. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly. Was she an alien? Alex said, his voice firm. And she saved us. For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then she nodded. She made a choice. We've all had to make sacrifices. She didn't have to, Alex said, his voice trembling with guilt. She could have stayed with us. She did what she thought was right, the woman replied. And because of that, you're here. Don't let her sacrifice go to waste. Alex clenched his fists, struggling to process her words. He wanted to believe that Lina's choice had meaning, that it wasn't just another senseless loss. But the weight of it all pressed heavily on his chest. As the hours passed, Alex watched as Marcus received medical attention, the color slowly returning to his face. The safe house was quiet but tense, the air thick with unspoken fears and fragile hope. Alex learned that the network was larger than he had imagined, a hidden web of humans and aliens working together to resist the oppression that had taken hold of the city. It was late into the night when the door opened again, and a figure stepped inside. Alex's heart stopped. It was Lina. She looked exhausted, her glowing patterns faint, and her movements slower than before, but she was alive. Alex rushed to her, relief flooding through him. "You're here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I fought." "I had escaped," Lina interrupted, her voice soft but steady. "They did not catch me." Alex couldn't help the grin that spread across his face. "You're incredible, you know that." Lina tilted her head, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "We are alive. That is enough." The others in the room watched the reunion quietly, their expressions a mix of curiosity and respect. Lina's presence seemed to ignite something in them, a reminder of why they were fighting. Over the next few days, Alex and Lina became part of the network, helping others find safety and hope. Lina's knowledge of her people and her ability to navigate the city's dangers proved invaluable. Together, they became a beacon of resistance, a symbol of what was possible when fear was replaced with courage. As the sun rose over the city one morning, Alex stood on the rooftop of the safe house, Lina by his side. The skyline stretched before them, a mix of towering skyscrapers and forgotten ruins. "We'll change this," Alex said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We'll make it better for everyone." Lina nodded, her glowing patterns shimmering faintly in the morning light. "Together," she said. And for the first time in a long while, Alex believed it was possible.